Picture this. It's the summer of 1862, and somewhere in the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains in what we now call Arizona, a 12-year-old Apache boy named Nana is pressed flat against cold stone, watching his entire world transform into something unrecognizable below him. The morning air still carries the scent of burning cedar from breakfast fires, but now that smoke mingles with something else entirely, the acrid smell of his village being systematically destroyed by American cavalry. Now, when we talk about childhood trauma in our modern world, we might think about divorce or changing schools. But imagine being 12 years old and watching uniformed strangers torch everything you've ever known while the morning prayers your grandmother taught you still echo off the canyon walls. This isn't just a boy hiding from soldiers. This is the moment that will forge one of the most innovative military minds in American history, though nobody knows it yet. From his hiding spot in that crevice, and think about this, the kid knew exactly where to hide, which tells you something about Apache childhood right there. Young Nana isn't just witnessing destruction, he's receiving an education that no military academy could provide. Every horse hoof striking stone below him, every shouted order echoing off the cliff faces, every tactical movement the cavalry makes through terrain they clearly don't understand. It's all being catalogued by a mind that's been trained since birth to read the land like other children read picture books. See, here's what makes this story so remarkable. While those soldiers down there are following standard military doctrine for clearing hostile settlements, they have absolutely no idea they're being observed by someone who will spend the next quarter-century turning their own tactics against them with devastating effectiveness. It's like watching the moment Luke Skywalker first sees a lightsaber, except this is real, and the force he's about to master is the ancient Apache understanding of how stone and shadow can become weapons more powerful than any rifle. The Apache didn't just live in this landscape, they were part of it in ways that would seem almost supernatural to outsiders. When Nana finally climbed down from that crevice, hours later, after the last cavalry horse had disappeared into the desert heat shimmer, he began an apprenticeship under Mangus Coloradas, one of the most feared Apache war leaders of the 19th century. But this wasn't boot camp as we'd understand it. This was something far more sophisticated. Mangus Coloradas taught Nana to read deer paths, yes, but not just for hunting. Those same trails that deer used to move unseen through Apache territory could carry warriors. He learned to identify water sources not just by taste or smell, but by the way sound carried differently in humid air, by how certain plants grew only near hidden springs, by the flight patterns of birds that revealed moisture 20 miles away. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Apache had what we might call a sacred geography. Every canyon, every peak, every seemingly random pile of boulders had meaning, had history, had strategic value that had been tested over centuries. Nana wasn't just learning to navigate terrain, he was inheriting a tactical library written in stone by dozens of generations of Apache warriors. Think about the difference between reading about mountain climbing in a book versus having a master climber guide you up an actual cliff face. Nana was getting the cliff face version of military education, learning secrets that couldn't be written down because they were embedded in the landscape itself. Apache boys didn't just run laps for conditioning, they ran ceremonial routes through terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers, their feet learning to find holds that were invisible to untrained eyes. The transformation really began during Nana's vision quest at 17. Now, vision quests might sound like mystical nonsense to our modern ears, but in Apache culture, they served a practical purpose alongside the spiritual one. Young warriors would spend days alone in the wilderness, fasting, meditating, but also observing, really observing, how the land worked. During this particular quest, something clicked for Nana. He was staring at what appeared to be a completely vertical cliff face, the kind that would stop any pursuing cavalry dead in their tracks. But as the light changed throughout the day, as shadows shifted and revealed subtle variations in the rock surface, he began to see something extraordinary. What looked like solid stone from below actually contained a network of ledges, handholds, and crevices that connected different levels of the cliff, like a three-dimensional highway. These weren't random geological formations. These were ancient handholds, carved by Apache ancestors generations ago, maintained and improved over centuries. The cliff face that appeared impassable to outsiders was actually a carefully engineered defensive position, invisible, unless you knew exactly what to look for and how to use it. The revelation was both spiritual and tactical. Nana understood in that moment that his people hadn't just adapted to this harsh landscape, they had become part of it, had learned to move through it in ways that defied every assumption about what was possible in warfare. The land itself would protect those who truly knew it, but only if they were worthy of its secrets. The first public demonstration of what Nana had learned came shortly after his vision quest ended. 20 Apache warriors had gathered in a canyon to witness what the young man claimed he could do. Picture the scene. Experienced fighters who had been raiding Mexican settlements and skirmishing with American troops for decades, watching this teenager approach a cliff face that looked absolutely vertical. What happened next defied every piece of conventional military wisdom those warriors possessed. Nana simply disappeared up the cliff, not climbed. That implies struggle, visible effort, the kind of movement that would draw enemy attention. He flowed up that stone surface like water flowing uphill, using handholds that seemed to materialize under his fingers, following a route that remained invisible even as they watched him use it. In 20 minutes, he had traveled what would have taken horses and men half a day to circumnavigate. He appeared on a ledge 60 feet above them, having moved through space in a way that should have been impossible. But more than that, from his new position, he commanded perfect fields of fire over the canyon floor. Any enemy trapped down there would be completely helpless against an attack from above. The watching warriors understood immediately what they had witnessed. This wasn't just an impressive athletic feat. This was a revolution in Apache warfare, a way to turn their deepest disadvantage, being vastly outnumbered by better-equipped enemies, into their greatest strength, if the mountains themselves could become weapons. But here's what makes this moment truly chilling from a historical perspective. As those 20 Apache warriors stared up at Nana perched on his impossible ledge, none of them could have imagined the full implications of what they'd just seen. They were witnessing the birth of a tactical innovation that would, over the next 25 years, cost the United States Army millions of dollars, hundreds of lives, and ultimately force them to completely rethink how warfare could be conducted in the American Southwest. The boy who had watched his village burn was about to teach the most powerful military in the world that sometimes the mountains themselves can fight back. By 1871, Nana had transformed from that traumatized 12-year-old into something the American military had never encountered before, a tactician who could turn geography itself into a weapon of mass destruction. And nowhere was this more evident than on a scorching July morning in Skeleton Canyon, where Captain Morrison led 80 cavalrymen into what would become one of the most studied military disasters in the history of the Indian Wars. Picture Captain Morrison's situation, AIDI, and really try to put yourself in his boots here. You're leading seasoned cavalry through terrain that looks like the surface of Mars, following what appears to be the only practical route through these mountains. Intelligence reports suggest Apache activity in the area, but your scouts haven't seen so much as a footprint. The canyon ahead narrows, yes, but it's the obvious choice. The alternative routes would add days to your patrol, and your men are already running low on water in this furnace-like heat. What Morrison couldn't know, what no cavalry officer of his era could possibly know, was that he was entering a killing machine 9 years in the making. Every boulder placement, every shadow pattern, every sight line in Skeleton Canyon had been analyzed, modified, and perfected by Nana's growing network of Apache tacticians. This wasn't just an ambush site. This was a carefully engineered death trap that had been tested on Mexican patrols and refined with each engagement. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable from a military perspective. As Morrison's column entered that narrow defile beneath towering cliffs, Nana's warriors were already in position 60 feet above them, moving along ledges that were completely invisible from below. Think about the physics of this for a moment. These weren't just hidden positions. These were three-dimensional firing platforms that allowed Apache fighters to attack from angles that defied every assumption about canyon warfare. And here's where Nana's communication system comes into play, something that was decades ahead of anything the army possessed. 20 miles away, Apache women stationed on distant peaks were already flashing mirror signals, relaying Morrison's exact numbers, speed, and equipment to warriors positioned throughout the canyon network. One flash meant cavalry, 2 flashes meant infantry, 3 meant artillery. A sustained flash meant immediate danger. The sophistication of this system would impress modern military communications specialists. Using carefully positioned mirrors, pieces of polished metal that could catch and redirect sunlight, Apache spotters could relay detailed tactical information across vast distances in seconds. Compare this to the Army's reliance on written messages carried by riders who might take hours or days to reach their destinations, assuming they weren't killed or captured along the way. But the real genius lay in Nana's criteria for selecting kill zones. This wasn't random. Every ambush site was chosen based on specific tactical principles that he had developed through years of careful study. First, the approach route had to appear safer than alternatives. Soldiers, like water, naturally flow along the path of least resistance. Second, the acoustic properties had to be perfect, sound needed to channel in ways that would confuse enemies about the direction of gunfire, while allowing Apache fighters to communicate with subtle calls that mimicked natural sounds. Third, and this is where it gets really sophisticated, the cliff faces had to have specific shadow patterns that would conceal warriors until the sun reached exactly the right angle. Nana had studied how light moved through these canyons at different times of day, different seasons, understanding that a position invisible at dawn might be completely exposed by noon. The massacre at Skeleton Canyon demonstrated all of these principles working in deadly harmony. As Morrison's 80 men moved deeper into the narrow passage, Apache fighters remained completely hidden despite being positioned directly above them. The canyon walls created an echo chamber that made rifle fire seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. And as the sun reached the critical angle Nana had calculated, shadows shifted to reveal Apache positions just as they opened fire. The psychological effect was devastating. Imagine being trapped in a narrow canyon with bullets raining down from positions you can't even see, with the sound bouncing off walls in ways that make it impossible to locate your attackers. Morrison's men fired wildly at cliff faces, wasting ammunition on empty stone, while Apache bullets found their marks with methodical precision. The economic mathematics were staggering. This single engagement cost the Army roughly $50,000 in today's money: horses, equipment, medical care for wounded survivors, replacement troops, investigation costs, the Apache expenditure, perhaps 20 rounds of ammunition and a few hours of coordination. It was asymmetric warfare at its most efficient. But Nana wasn't content with single victories. He was building something unprecedented, a network of interconnected kill zones that could channel enemy forces from one death trap to another. The Day of Screaming Eagles demonstrated this system at its most sophisticated. 200 soldiers, tracking what they believed was a small Apache raiding party, found themselves facing fire from positions that seemed to violate the laws of physics. The name comes from the sound the wind made through the carefully modified rock formations. Apache engineers had literally carved the stone to create acoustic effects that would terrify enemies while masking the movement of their own fighters. As soldiers tried to escape one ambush site, they were funneled directly into another, then another, in a deadly chain reaction that Nana had choreographed like a ballet of destruction. Here's what really separated Nana from other Apache leaders of his era. He understood that knowledge was power, but only if it could be transmitted. He began systematically teaching his methods to younger warriors, including an intense young fighter named Geronimo, who would later become a household name. But unlike the popular image of Geronimo as a wild savage, the man Nana trained was a careful student of tactical innovation. Nana's teaching methods were as revolutionary as his tactics. He would position one warrior at a supposedly impregnable defensive position, then demonstrate how that single fighter could hold off 50 enemies simply by controlling the only approach route. Not through superior firepower or magical Apache abilities, but through precise understanding of terrain, sight lines, and human psychology. The demonstration that really drove the point home involved a narrow ledge overlooking a canyon approach. Nana showed how one Apache with a rifle and sufficient ammunition could make any passage below completely impassable, not by killing everyone, though he could, but by making it clear that attempting passage meant certain death. The psychological effect was often more powerful than actual combat. This is where modern special forces training begins to echo Nana's innovations. The principle of force multiplication, using terrain, positioning, and psychology to make a small unit far more effective than its numbers would suggest, became a cornerstone of asymmetric warfare that military academies still teach today. By the end of this period, Nana had created something unprecedented in American military history. Not just a fighting force, but an entire strategic system that turned the Apache homeland into an impregnable fortress defended by fighters who could appear and disappear like ghosts, who could strike with devastating effectiveness and vanish into stone faces that seemed solid to pursuing enemies. The kill zones had become something more than tactical positions. They were the foundation of an Apache renaissance, a brief shining moment when a small nation had discovered how to make geography itself fight alongside them against impossible odds. Between 1880 and 1883, something extraordinary happened in the American Southwest, 18p, a period so remarkable that military historians still struggle to categorize it properly. For 3 years, Apache territory became something that had never existed before in North America. A de facto independent nation defended not by superior numbers or advanced weaponry, but by the complete integration of Nana's tactical innovations into every aspect of Apache life and spirituality. Picture a typical morning in an Apache stronghold during this golden age. Children wake up and immediately begin playing what they call shadow warrior games, elaborate contests that mimic Nana's cliff movements while developing the muscle memory and spatial awareness that might save their lives someday. These aren't just games. They're a sophisticated training program disguised as childhood fun, teaching 8-year-olds to read stone surfaces the way other children learn to read books. Meanwhile, grandmothers grind corn within easy sight of concealed sentries, positioned on ledges that remain invisible to any observer more than 50 yards away. The entire rhythm of daily life has been choreographed around defensive principles that make the stronghold simultaneously comfortable for families and absolutely impregnable to attacking forces. It's domestic life and military fortress combined in ways that defy every conventional understanding of how human settlements should work. But the true test of this system came during the Battle of Tres Castillos, where Nana orchestrated what might be the most complex military operation in Apache history. Picture this. 900 Mexican soldiers, well-equipped and experienced in fighting Apache raiders, advancing through terrain they believed they understood. What they encountered instead was something unprecedented. 300 Apache fighters, moving through interconnected positions like blood flowing through arteries, appearing and disappearing in patterns that seemed to violate every law of military science. The battle lasted 3 days, but calling it a battle almost misses the point. This was more like watching a master chess player dismantle an opponent who didn't even realize they were playing chess. Mexican commanders found their forces constantly outflanked by enemies who seemed to materialize from solid rock, strike with devastating precision, then vanish completely before any counterattack could be organized. Nana's innovation here wasn't just tactical, it was logistical. Those 300 Apache fighters weren't operating as independent units. They were components of a single, integrated system, where every movement was coordinated through signals that remained invisible to Mexican observers. Apache women, positioned on peaks that looked like random geological features, managed a communication network that could relay tactical information across 20 miles faster than any military telegraph system of the era. Think about the implications of this for a moment. While the Mexican army was relying on written orders carried by messengers who might take hours to reach their destinations, Apache forces were communicating in real time through mirror flashes and smoke signals that appeared to be natural phenomena. A single flash could indicate enemy troop strength, 2 flashes meant they were carrying artillery. A specific pattern of smoke puffs could coordinate the movement of fighters across multiple canyon systems simultaneously. But here's what really made this period remarkable: the economic control that these defensive positions provided. Mining companies operating in Apache territory began paying what amounted to protection fees, understanding that attempting to work without Apache consent meant facing harassment that could bankrupt even well-funded operations. Wagon trains detoured hundreds of miles rather than risk passage through areas where Nana's network maintained kill zones. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. Traditional military operations in this terrain cost enormous amounts of money while achieving minimal results. Negotiating with Apache leaders, on the other hand, allowed commerce to flow while respecting Apache sovereignty over their ancestral lands. For a brief moment, economic reality seemed to favor a solution that granted Apache independence. Entire regions became de facto Apache territory, despite the Apache being vastly outnumbered by American and Mexican populations. This wasn't conquest in any traditional sense. It was something far more sophisticated. The Apache had discovered how to make their homeland so expensive to invade that invasion became economically impossible, while maintaining enough flexibility to allow peaceful commerce on terms they controlled. The spiritual dimension of this period is equally remarkable. Kill zones weren't just military positions, they were sacred sites where Apache warriors believed mountain spirits fought alongside them. Before major engagements, elaborate ceremonies were performed in these locations, ceremonies that combined tactical planning with spiritual preparation in ways that reinforced both the religious significance of the homeland and the military effectiveness of its defenders. These weren't separate activities. Spiritual and tactical preparation were completely integrated. Warriors who spent hours in meditation at kill zone sites weren't just praying for victory, they were visualizing sightlines, memorizing escape routes, and mentally rehearsing the coordinated movements that would turn individual fighters into components of a larger defensive machine. At the height of this period, even veteran Indian fighters like General Crook, a man who had built his career on successful campaigns against Native American resistance, admitted in official reports that certain canyons had become completely impassable to military forces, not difficult to traverse, not dangerous to enter, but actually impassable. Crook, who understood Apache tactics better than any American officer of his generation, recognized that Nana had created something unprecedented, geographical positions that had become militarily impregnable through human innovation. The psychological effect on American and Mexican military planning was profound. Maps began appearing with entire regions marked as Apache-controlled, areas where government forces simply could not operate effectively. For the first time since European colonization began, a Native American nation had achieved something approaching true territorial sovereignty through military innovation rather than treaty negotiation. But this golden age contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very success of Apache resistance began attracting attention from military innovators who saw Nana's tactics as problems to be solved rather than simply endured. Improved mapping technology slowly began revealing the secrets of Apache kill zones. Long-range rifles reduced the advantage of elevated positions. Most devastating of all, Apache scouts began working for the army, selling knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. The irony is heartbreaking when you really think about it. Apache tactical superiority had created a brief moment when a small nation could defend its homeland against overwhelming odds. But that same tactical sophistication made Apache knowledge incredibly valuable to their enemies. The very innovations that had made Apache independence possible became commodities that could be purchased, studied, and ultimately turned against their creators. Yet even as cracks began appearing in the defensive network, even as improved technology and recruited Apache scouts began compromising kill zone locations, the fundamental achievement remained intact. For 3 years, a small nation had demonstrated that superior knowledge of terrain could triumph over superior numbers and equipment. They had proven that innovation, courage, and intimate understanding of homeland could create military effectiveness that seemed almost supernatural to outside observers. The children who had learned Shadow Warrior games during this period would carry those skills forward into a very different world. The grandmothers who had ground corn within sight of invisible sentries would tell stories that preserved tactical knowledge even after the kill zones themselves were compromised. The mountain spirits who had fought alongside Apache warriors would remain in the landscape, waiting for future generations who might need to remember that sometimes the land itself can become a weapon. The final years, from 1884 to 1886, witnessed something that feels almost Greek in its tragic inevitability. Tanyo, the slow, methodical erosion of Apache advantages that had seemed almost supernatural just a few years earlier. Yet what makes this period so compelling isn't the defeat itself, but how Nana's innovations transcended military failure to become something larger, something that would influence warfare and Apache identity for generations to come. Picture Nana in 1885, now over 70 years old, making his last stand in the original Devil's Backbone kill zone where his revolution had begun decades earlier. His hair is white, his movements slower than they once were, but his understanding of terrain remains as sharp as obsidian. When he approaches that familiar cliff face, muscle memory takes over, and for a few moments, the old man moves with something approaching his legendary grace. The 2-week siege that followed became a masterclass in how technological advancement could gradually overcome even the most sophisticated tactical innovations. 15 Apache warriors, led by a man who had spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of Perth, mountain warfare, held off 500 soldiers in a demonstration of everything Nana had learned about turning geography into weaponry. But this wasn't the same kind of engagement that had made Apache resistance so devastating in previous decades. The soldiers besieging Devil's Backbone carried rifles with ranges that could reach previously invulnerable positions. They possessed detailed maps, marking secret paths that had once been known only to Apache fighters. Most heartbreaking of all, their guides included Apache scouts who had grown up learning the same terrain-reading skills that Nana had perfected, now using that knowledge to help enemies locate hidden positions. The siege demonstrated both the enduring effectiveness of Nana's methods and their ultimate limitations against determined technological advancement. For 14 days, 15 Apache fighters made it impossible for 500 soldiers to advance up a single canyon. The mathematics of force multiplication that Nana had pioneered still worked, but only as long as the technological gap between attackers and defenders remained manageable. Artillery changed everything. When shells began exploding on ledges that had been impregnable to rifle fire, when positions that had been invisible to ground observers became vulnerable to weapons that could reach them from miles away, the fundamental assumptions underlying Apache tactical superiority began to crumble. The mountains themselves were still on the Apache side, but human technology was gradually overpowering geographical advantage. Yet, even in defeat, even as his last stronghold finally fell to overwhelming firepower and detailed intelligence provided by Apache turncoats, Nana achieved something remarkable. The siege had been observed by American officers who recognized they were witnessing military principles that transcended the specific conflict they were fighting. The after-action reports from Devil's Backbone contain detailed analyses of how small forces could achieve such devastating effectiveness against larger, better-equipped enemies. These reports found their way to military academies where they were studied, discussed, and gradually incorporated into American tactical doctrine. West Point cadets in the 1890s were learning principles that Nana had pioneered in Apache Canyon systems. World War I officers trained in techniques that could trace their intellectual lineage directly back to that 12-year-old boy hiding in a crevice during the burning of his village. The influence became even more direct during World War II, when Apache code talkers used inherited terrain reading skills to provide communications security that baffled enemy cryptographers. These weren't just men who spoke Apache. They were descendants of warriors who had learned to read landscape as a tactical language, who understood how geography could be used to conceal movement and coordinate complex operations. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Nana's innovations appeared in the development of special forces training in the decades following World War II. Military planners studying unconventional warfare kept returning to the same historical examples. Small units achieving disproportionate effectiveness through superior knowledge of terrain, careful selection of engagement zones, and the psychological impact of forces that could appear and disappear at will. Modern special forces training incorporates principles that Nana would recognize immediately, using natural features to multiply force effectiveness, selecting positions that provide multiple escape routes, coordinating complex operations through minimal communication signals, and above all, understanding that superior knowledge of terrain can overcome almost any disadvantage in numbers or equipment. The intellectual lineage is clear and documentable. Apache tactical innovations, studied by American officers in the 1880s, influenced military doctrine that shaped special forces training that continues to this day. Every Navy SEAL who learns to use landscape for concealment, every Army Ranger who practices moving through terrain without leaving traces, every Special Forces operator who understands how psychological warfare can multiply physical effectiveness, AR, they're all, in some sense, students of lessons that Nana pioneered in the mountains of Arizona and New Mexico. But the story doesn't end with military applications. In the decades following Nana's death, Apache youth began retracing his roots as spiritual journeys, performing ceremonies where their ancestors had turned stone itself into a weapon. These weren't historical reenactments, IMACA, they were living connections to a period when Apache innovation had achieved something unprecedented in the history of indigenous resistance. The mountains themselves became repositories of tactical knowledge. Hidden handholds, carved by ancient Apache engineers, remained embedded in cliff faces, invisible to casual observers, but still discoverable by young people who learned to read stone the way their ancestors had. Water sources identified through generations of Apache observation continued to sustain travelers who knew where to look. Game trails that had once carried warriors still provided routes through terrain that appeared impassable to outsiders. Today, tourist trains run through some of these same canyons, carrying passengers who remain completely unaware they're traveling through corridors, where one scout's genius once made a small nation militarily invincible. The tourists see beautiful landscapes, impressive geological formations, perhaps some wildlife. They don't see the invisible infrastructure of tactical innovation that still exists in those stone faces, still waiting for someone with the right knowledge to activate it. But Apache people see differently. When contemporary Apache youth undertake ceremonial journeys through these landscapes, they're not just honoring ancestors. Landscapes, they're accessing a tactical library written in stone, preserved in the landscape itself. The handholds are still there. The sightlines still command the same fields of fire. The acoustic properties that once channeled sound to confuse enemies still shape how noise carries through narrow canyons. The mountains remember warriors who moved like shadows along their faces, who learned to make geography itself fight against impossible odds. And in remembering, they preserve not just historical knowledge but practical wisdom about how innovation, courage, and intimate understanding of homeland can sometimes achieve what seems impossible. Nana's revolution ended with military defeat, but his innovations became part of something larger, a demonstration that small nations defending their homelands can develop tactical sophistication that influences military thinking for generations. The boy who watched his village burn grew up to teach the world that sometimes, if you know the mountains well enough, you can make them fight alongside you. And in the end, perhaps that's the most profound victory of all. Not the temporary achievement of military success, but the permanent contribution of tactical innovation that continues to shape how warriors think about the relationship between knowledge, landscape, and power. The mountains of the American Southwest still remember Nana, and through them his revolution continues.